This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have victims. Welcome to BreakPoint This Week. John Stonestreet here, along with Warren Smith. I'm recording this from a hotel room in Toronto, where I'm spending the weekend speaking to the Synod of the Anglican Church, kind of Western Diocese of Nigeria, what's called Cana West. And so you might hear a little traffic, and the planes are very, very close at the hotel that I'm at, Warren. So you might hear a plane take off here in the background, too.
Yeah, so far so good. As long as they don't land on you, I guess we'll be all right for the next half hour or so.
Yeah, I say that's the least we can hope for, I suppose. A big week historically, two major anniversaries this week. I know the president, many military leaders. In fact, here in Toronto, there was a good bit of ceremony surrounding the 75th anniversary of one of the most remarkable days in history, much less military history. Of course, the remembrance of D-Day, or that event which basically changed the course of human history by changing the course of the Second World War.
Yeah, it certainly did. 10,000 American servicemen and women buried at Omaha Beach. You know, I remember Colin Powell saying that one of the things that was different about America than any other really superpower in all of world history is that whenever we went to a country, we didn't take that country. We just asked for enough land to bury our dead. And then we would go home. And now, of course, the Native Americans might feel a little differently about that, but so there is some complicated history there. But I think in general, what Colin Powell said was so true that, you know, Americans sacrificed bravely at Omaha Beach on D-Day, and so did Canadians. Since you're in Toronto, we should acknowledge the Canadians. I mean, it was really a global fight against one of the most horrible totalitarian regimes of the 20th century.
Well, this is related to the second anniversary, and it was something that we talked about on BreakPoint on June the 4th, so just a couple days ago, and that's the history of Tiananmen Square. And one of the things that struck me is what we've seen, I think, particularly among millennials, the younger generation, and I think in kind of their political heroes currently, whether we're talking about, you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whether we're talking about Pete Buttigieg, certainly Bernie Sanders. There's a memory of kind of the great fights of the past that I think is lost on this generation. And, you know, that was one of the things we talked about. This is also the week where we remember Tiananmen Square and that massacre that took place 30 years ago. And, you know, this was a time when America watched, and it was pretty clear in all of our minds that communism, for example, belonged in the dustbin of the great evils of history, that this was an ideology in which the state was elevated over the individual, and that basically not only did not bring prosperity, but it almost inevitably, and I would even say it inevitably devolved into totalitarianism in one way or another. The Black Book of Communism, you know, cites that about 100 million people were slaughtered in the 20th century just in the name of that ideology. And of course, the Tiananmen Square massacre was an example of that, and the casualties there vary from hundreds to 10,000 people during that kind of crackdown time of the communist government against some demonstrators. This was also started by students, and yet today you have, I think, by and large, the statistics tell us that the Chinese don't remember Chairman Mao in kind of that same way, and that many Americans, especially American students, think of communism as a potential good, not an inevitable bad. I guess I was thinking about this week in light of D-Day, a nation that, not only a nation, but a world that doesn't know history. I mean, we know the famous axiom, you know, he who forgets history is condemned to repeat it. But I think we're talking about more than that. I mean, if we don't actually know our history, it's going to be hard for us, I think, to be discerning when an ideology itself is evil. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to start this week's program talking about these historical events, because this historical memory collectively is a really important thing if we're going to have a future that's life-giving and not dealing with the same evil that we have in the past.
Well, I think that's right, John. I think you're right to talk about history in the context of these ideologies, because these ideologies look good on paper. Some of them do. I mean, there are aspects, for example, of socialism that we might admire if we would forget what the consequences of socialism has been and communism has been throughout history, and if we forget about human nature. So ultimately there is a worldview, an understanding of who God is and who we are in relationship to God, what the world is, which is, according to Christian understanding of the word, it's a broken place. And if we forget these worldview aspects of these questions, I think that that's the reason we will often be seduced by an ideology that looks good on paper but doesn't play out well over time and throughout history.
Yeah, and I think that what we need to say, specifically about communism, and especially it's like communism has really made a comeback here. It's not the bad word that it has been kind of across the board for the last 30, 40 years of kind of world history, but specifically U.S. history. And I think that you kind of alluded to it, but let's be really clear on this. I mean, communism not only has a terrible track record in history, and by a terrible track record, like a terrible track record, but it's the reason it has a terrible track record is because of, how we began the program. Ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims, and communism misunderstands the human person. The Bible gives us the first 2 chapters of the human story as creation and fall, and communism misses both of them. So first of all, communism is an intentionally atheistic system. So it sees individuals not as bearing the image of God, not as unique, but fundamentally misses it in 2 ways. That first of all, individuals aren't valuable in and of themselves. That's why so many of them in history were sacrificed on the name of the kind of this inevitable march toward utopia that communism promised but never reached. That if individuals need to be sacrificed for quote unquote the greater good, and that completely misses the fact that culture matters because individuals matter. Society matters because individuals matter. Communism sacrificed individuals on the altar of society. And the other thing that it missed, I think, about human nature in the creation part of the story, Warren, was communism sees humanity as fundamentally consumers of resources. So the idea of innovation, the idea of kind of creativity, the idea of humans being able to look at the world of resources and bring non-tangible assets to the table that's actually going to make the quote-unquote pie bigger and better and be able to feed more people. That was it missed, and basically saw human beings as being fundamentally consumers of goods rather than also producers. It saw humans as a problem to be solved rather than part of the solution. And then, of course, you've got the fall chapter, and the fall says, look, the problem is not out there, the problem's in here. And again, communism didn't see that, and so therefore, if you can, in the name of this greater good ideology, the idea was that eventually, we would rid the world of classes, we would rid the world of power, and those that were powerless. And all it did, because it basically put, evil into a box outside of, every single human, saw humans as kind of basically good as long as they had the best intentions in mind. Well, we saw some of the greatest evils perpetrated by those who hoarded power and hoarded resources and hoarded all kinds of goods while individuals were starving. If you miss what it means to be human, so much of what we talk about on BreakPoint, so much of what you and I talk about here on BreakPoint this week rest on the definition of what it means to be human and how significant it is for Christians to understand what the image of God is.
Well, John, that's exactly right. And I love the fact that you rooted it in Genesis 1 and 2 because, the first words of the Bible, in the beginning, God created. I mean, that idea that humans are a good in the world, that human creativity can create good for the world is such an important idea in Scripture, such an important idea that we need to bring into just society as those of us who are Christians are involved in public policy in the public square, and something we need to stand against whenever that idea is not prominent in communism, socialism, and related ideologies.
You're listening to BreakPoint This Week. Come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage there that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. We'll link you to 2 commentaries that were aired on BreakPoint this week, both on D-Day and on remembering Tiananmen Square and a worldview analysis of communism. I'm John Stonestreet with Warren Smith. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Back on BreakPoint this week, here with Warren Smith. Warren, an interesting story went around the internet this week, and it was covered by, I think, some major media outlets, particularly, I think, the Daily Telegraph, some other UK newspapers. But it had to do with a Dutch teenager, 17 years old, tragically had suffered sexual abuse in her background. And the headline of the story announced that she had received kind of government permission and basically ended her life through doctor assistance because of the euthanasia laws. And of course, that got everyone's attention because it was a mental unbearable suffering, to use her words, rather than a physical one. Turns out the story wasn't complete. The headlines weren't completely true, but there's a whole lot here in the story that I think tells us a lot about our cultural moment when it comes to what we think about life and human dignity.
In the Dutch health ministry, in fact, had to issue a statement clarifying some of the issues there. This girl apparently had asked to be euthanized, and I guess because she was a minor, was not allowed. But among the various mental issues that she was dealing with, mental health issues that she was dealing with, was anorexia. So they're investigating the cause of her death right now, but it's probably related to her anorexia, they're saying. So very complicated, but it does. The fact that the story has become a worldwide story, I think, has highlighted a couple of things. Number one is it is shining a bright light on this Dutch law, this Dutch euthanasia law. And number two, it's shining a light on mental health generally, especially among teenagers, and whether they are competent or not to make these kinds of decisions for themselves. And I think just thirdly, John, from a Christian point of view, it is just so tragic, and it just highlights the need for those of us who have hope, have the hope of Christ, have the hope of Jesus, to be reaching out to folks who may not and are struggling with mental health issues, and try to be a resource and a help to them.
Well, I want to add one more angle to it, if I can. The girl's name's Noah Podhoven, and she posted a few days before her death on Instagram that she had stopped eating and drinking, and it had been decided to let me go. Now, that's where kind of the question came in, and it was clear that she had asked to be euthanized and that it had been kind of granted to, quote-unquote, let her go after discussions and evaluations. Now, like you said, it turned out that her request for, kind of official euthanasia had been denied, but what seems to be clear is that she starved herself to death and that her parents allowed her to do it and agreed with it, and that her doctors didn't interfere. Now, we're talking about a minor, at least by American law, 17 years old. We're also talking about someone who make this decision to commit suicide because, quote, my suffering is unbearable. That's what she wrote on Instagram. Now, look, here's the thing. I think doctor-assisted suicide and euthanasia are always sold on a bill of goods. The first bill of goods is that these are individuals who are suffering unbearably physically, and this is going to eventually kill them, so why extend their suffering? And what we found is that becomes the talking point, but that the vast majority of those who make this decision officially are doing it out of mental suffering and mental concerns and emotional well-being issues, not because of physical pain. The second thing is that then it becomes this really slippery slope about what is unbearable suffering. Not only is it physical and not emotional and so on, but then who qualifies? I mean, we're talking about someone who desperately, desperately needs help, and she's 17 years old. But here's the deeper question. We don't have hard and fast numbers on this, but on Monday's BreakPoint, I'm going to refer to a study because the other bill of goods that especially I think doctor-assisted suicide is sold to us on is that it will reduce the number of regular suicides. Now, it's not clear why a regular suicide is any more tragic than a doctor-assisted suicide in any of this, but that's the promise. But what we've seen is at least a few studies. A 2015 study by Oxford researchers found that U.S. states where doctor-assisted suicide became legal saw a 6% increase in total suicides. But even more, a 2017 study by Dutch researchers is showing that the option of euthanasia, and I'm quoting here, the option of euthanasia for people with psychiatric conditions does not reduce the number of non-assisted suicide, but rather contributes to a rise in their numbers. Look, a quarter of deaths in the Netherlands are induced. Now, that's induced means suicide, murder, or euthanasia. The murder rate in the Netherlands is extremely low. That means the suicide and euthanasia rate are really high. And we know the euthanasia rate has gone up, but also has the non-official or the non-approved suicide rate. In other words, I think what we saw in this story is that the possibility of legalized suicide makes thinkable and makes acceptable the idea of suicide itself as a resort, maybe the last resort, but it still becomes an option because suicide gets seen as a remedy.
Well, I think that's right. I think it was Pope John Paul II who talked about a culture of death. And I think that that's one of the things that assisted suicide. It helps to create that culture of death where suicide becomes more normalized. Any stigma associated with it goes away. And I think this idea of mental and emotional anguish being an acceptable reason to commit suicide or to have doctors assist you in suicide is such a pernicious idea, John. And as you say, the studies in this arena are kind of few and far between. But there's one study that was interesting, I thought, that I read a couple of years ago. 29 people who survived a suicide attempt jumping off of San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge later said that they regretted their decision, all 29 of them. And, people will commit suicide in the depths of a depression. And if we can help these folks get through that, often the pain subsides. Often their desire to live returns. And I think that allowing people to kill themselves and even helping them kill themselves when they're in that state of depression is just such a horrible way for society and for a culture to respond.
Yeah, and listen, we're going to be following this one. There's going to be a whole lot more stories like this, and they're all going to be tragic. And I think as Christians who value life from the moment of conception to the moment of natural death, that's got to be another issue that's high on our radar, especially reaching out as the suicide numbers go up. I want to also talk about Baronelle Stutzman. That's a name we haven't mentioned in quite a while here on BreakPoint or BreakPoint this week. Baronelle, of course, is the Christian florist in the state of Washington who, like Jack Phillips, has been basically penalized for refusing to participate in a same-sex wedding. And this is from a longtime client whom she knew was gay. And this is once the state of Washington legalized same-sex marriage, this client asked her to specifically design flowers for his wedding. She said that she could not, and the state of Washington came after her. Now, there's an interesting development this week, Warren. After the Jack Phillips decision, and let me just remind everyone, Jack Phillips is the Colorado baker, and one of Justice Kennedy's last decisions was basically to say that the Civil Rights Commission was wrong of the state of Colorado, not necessarily because of what they ruled, but because they treated Jack unfairly. They treated his religious conviction with animus. The Baronelle's case, which bubbled up, similar time frame, the court instructed the state of Washington to reevaluate the case. It's called vacating the decision. Essentially told them, look, in light of what we've decided on Jack Phillips, go back and see, is there evidence of any animus from your courts in light of the decision that was made? Well, I think they vacated the decision, turned around and said, nope, we did nothing wrong, and Baronelle now still faces ruinous fines, the sort of threats to her personal assets, her well-being, really an unprecedented level of punishment that's going to basically financially ruin her if this stands. And basically, I think we've got another case headed to the Supreme Court because the Alliance Defending Freedom, who's representing Baronelle, has filed an appeal again.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, ADF, of course, did great work on the Jack Phillips case, and they've been representing Baronelle. And I know, John, you speak a lot at Alliance Defending Freedom events, and you've had the opportunity to meet Baronelle and Jack Phillips. And they're just remarkable people that have stood up in the face of tremendous odds against them, but also tremendous anger. It is interesting to me that the Washington Supreme Court made the decision so quickly that they had no animus against Baronelle Stutzman, because if you really know all of the facts and circumstances of that case, there has been such animosity directed against Baronelle for years now that this case has been going on. Now, I'm sure that the Washington Supreme Court might answer that by saying, she might be enduring animosity or animus, but not by us, and we can all have our own opinions about that. But I think we should constantly be praying for these folks. We should be thanking organizations and financially supporting organizations like Alliance Defending Freedom, because there, but for the grace of God, go many of us in the future if they lose these cases.
Well, look, I have met Baronelle and I have met Jack. I consider both of them actually friends, especially, I've spent a little bit more time with Jack than Baronelle. But the caricature of the angry Christian who just can't wait to get those, LGBT people, it just could not be less true about these individuals. That's what's so remarkable. And I think for those of us that are listening going, man, they must have been mean. They must have been cruel. They must have kicked him out of the shop, right? Why did they refuse to serve gay people? Why do they hate gay people? None of that is true at any level with either of those two individuals. Both of them served individuals who identified as LGBT. Both had a history of doing it. Both of them had hired people. I think both of them, at least I know. At least Jack has, and that identifies LGBT in the history of their stores. I mean, this isn't new. Both of them have lived out their faith convictions in their business in other ways, like refusing business in other situations. And I think one of the things we got to say is, look, you can't be nice enough. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be nice. There's a huge debate happening right now in conservatism whether we should be kind and nice or not, and it involves kind of two thought leaders in that. But for Christians, look, it doesn't mean because we can't be nice enough that we shouldn't. We should be kind and loving. But nice and soft and bowling over is a different point altogether. And it may come at your doorstep, as you said. In fact, this week on the BreakPoint podcast, we heard from someone who we heard from at the Wilberforce weekend, who's also kind of one of these stories as well, and that's Chief Kelvin Cochran. Yeah, well, he gave a fantastic speech at the Wilberforce weekend, and I'm so glad we're able to put that up on the podcast so people can listen to it. But yeah, this is an example of a guy who had lived his entire life, his entire career in service of others, to the point where he finally had his dream job as the fire chief of one of the great cities in America, Atlanta, and it was all taken from him because of something he did in his church. He did it as part of a men's Bible study. And there's just such an array of forces that are focused on folks like Kelvin Cochran and Baronelle Stutzman and Jack Phillips that, again, if we don't stand with them, there will come a day whenever those forces will be aligned against us. So I'm so honored to be in partnership here at the Colson Center with organizations like ADF who are standing with these folks. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here with Warren Smith. If you don't want to miss a single episode of our conversation that happens each and every week, and also you want to catch terrific presentations and talks and interviews like the one that we just talked about with Kelvin Cochran, subscribe to the BreakPoint podcast. Wherever you get a podcast, just look up BreakPoint or the BreakPoint podcast and just hit subscribe, and you won't miss a single program. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week. Stay with us.
You can learn more about BreakPoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
We're back on BreakPoint This Week, and Warren Smith, before we wrap up, we just got a few minutes left. We had a listener just a couple weeks ago say, you guys are talking about pro-life all the time. And yes, we are, because there is a ton of stuff happening right now on the pro-life front, including this week in Illinois.
Yeah, that's right. The legislation under consideration in Illinois would allow apparently non-doctors to perform abortions, to require all private health insurance plans to cover elective abortions, and eliminate reporting requirements. And it would eliminate reporting requirements as well as regulations requiring investigation of maternal deaths due to abortion. You know, John, what's particularly ironic to me about that legislation, if it passes, is that, one of the arguments that pro-abort activists have been using for years to make abortion legal is that it would get us out of the back alley abortion business. It would get us out of having folks who were not qualified to do abortions actually do the abortions. Now, I've always thought that was a specious argument, but if you even accept their argument on their terms, we're going right back to that place with this new law in Illinois. It would basically be the Wild West, a frontier of just anybody being able to conduct an abortion.
Well, and we know what happens when there's not government oversight. We know what happens when these things aren't regulated and when these things aren't inspected, because we saw what happened in the city of Philadelphia with Kermit Gosnell, where if you ran a nail salon, you would have to undergo way more rigorous inspections, and there would be far more regulations overseeing what you're doing. Running an abortion clinic, and 30 years later, we saw basically what investigators called a house of horrors. And is that really what we want? I mean, you're right. It's an incredible incredible irony. By the way, just this past week, the Washington Post called Planned Parenthood's claim that thousands and thousands of women died in back alley abortions. It gave it, 4 Pinocchios or 3 Pinocchios?
Right.
4 Pinocchios. And that's a Washington Post way of saying you're lying. And which is really something that the pro-abortion Washington Post would basically tell Leanna Wen, the president of Planned Parenthood, that you're basically just repeating a lie. And yet the same forces that basically claim to be about women's health, that this whole thing is about keeping women safe, now want to remove more regulations that provide any sort of oversight that would be standard for a surgical center or a medical office, in any other situation. Well, come to breakpoint.org, click on the link here on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to the various stories and articles that we mentioned on today's program. And also keep in mind that the Colson Center is a listener-supported organization. So all the BreakPoint commentaries and this weekly conversation that Warren and I have is only made possible because of the generous support of folks like you. You can give to the Colson Center, and now's a great time to do it. We're coming up to the end of our fiscal year, and the giving at this time really helps us plan and budget for the sort of content that we can make available in the coming year. So again, please consider giving a gift by June the 30th. Come to breakpoint.org, and across the top, you'll see a button that says Give. That's a great way to give a tax-deductible donation to support the work of BreakPoint and the Colson Center. Well, thanks for joining us. Join us again here next week when we talk about the issues of the culture from a Christian worldview. Remember, ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. For Warren Smith, I'm John Stonestreet. Thanks for joining us.